Valheim, a buy-to-play survival sandbox game by Iron Gate Studio that was released as early access in 2021 for PC and 2023 for Xbox. The game is still in early access, however, it has seen tremendous success, selling just over 5 million copies only a month after its initial release on Steam. Valheim features a massive open world that is procedurally generated, so every map seed is somewhat random and no two playthroughs will ever be the same. You spawn in as a fallen Viking and you need to figure out how to survive and flourish within this world. Each world is split into biomes that will have a variety of resources and challenges and enemies, all of which collecting, completing, and defeating will award you with more and more ways to progress. I've never personally played too many survival games, however Valheim has been on my list for a long time, as it seems to take many typical RPG elements that you might be used to and smashes it all together in a sort of Minecraft meets Rust meets Souls-like, all in a giant Viking-themed amalgamation. So without further ado, I decided to play Valheim for 100 hours to help you guys determine if this game is worth picking up in 2025, even though it's still in early access. You might notice immediately that the graphics are seemingly a bit blocky and the textures are a little low poly. Throughout this video, however, you will see as I come across some of the most beautiful and amazing landscapes. It's hard to explain, but Valheim somehow has the best graphics while at the same time having some of the most mediocre graphics. It's actually impressive, and to be honest, over the course of my 100 hours, I've really come to appreciate the graphical charm of Valheim. So after I was happy with my appearance, I named myself Waydot and was told to create a world, which I very creatively named Waydot's World, and start. Now, the first time loading into the world takes slightly longer because it's obviously generating the world. It has to create the biomes, the oceans, the mountains, the ravines, the random dungeons, the spawns. So don't be concerned if it's your first time booting up a new world and it takes a while. Anyway, you wake up standing on this stone platform in the center of 7 other stones around you, featuring chains and pictures of creatures. There's a crow in front of you, which basically acts as a sort of tutorial, which is actually an optional feature. You can turn this crow off if you'd like, but considering I was a brand new player both to Valheim and basically the survival genre, I figured I could use the tips and tricks. The user interface is extremely minimal. You have a health bar in the bottom left and 3 slots for consumables, which become essential almost immediately. In the top right, you have a minimap, which features a fog of war mechanic, displaying the area you're currently in, and also relevant information such as what biome you're in and which way the wind is currently blowing. To the left here, you'll see your buffs and debuffs. I currently have the wet debuff as I spawned into a rainstorm. Being wet reduces your health and stamina regeneration. And finally, in the top left, you have your equipped items. There's actually 8 slots available here, but as I currently only own a torch, that's the only option I have at the moment. The crow then talks about these stones that are surrounding me. Each of them represents one of the 7 bosses within Valheim. This red glowing stone in front of me is called a Eikthyr, I think. And this will mark on the map where there's an altar which allows you to summon one of these bosses. The game immediately points you in the direction of the first boss, Eikthyr. However, finding the glowing red stone, or Eikthyr, for the other bosses can be a little bit more challenging. As you can see on my map, the altar to fight Eikthyr seems pretty close to me, and in a sense, it is. But one thing you don't quite understand, or you can't really comprehend when you first jump into Valheim, is just how massive this map is. By the end of the 100-hour playthrough, this is what my full map looked like. I probably explored less than 5% of the actual entire world that was available to me. And trust me, I do a lot of traveling and a lot of exploring. Anyway, as with any survival game, I was immediately lost as to what I'm supposed to do. I noticed the sun was coming up and it had stopped raining, so my wet debuff was ticking down. Valheim operates on a day and night cycle, with days being 21 minutes long and night only being 9 minutes. So you live through a full 24 hours in game, every half hour in real life. It's like that one planet in Interstellar. Next, while I was running around and reading some more of these sacrificial stones, I actually leveled up my running skill to level 1. Basically, everything you do in Valheim will give you some experience towards that activity. So running, jumping, swimming, fishing, mining, woodcutting, as well as weapon skills like swords and bows and spears, you'll constantly be leveling up your skills, and these levels apply a modifier towards that skill, which will make it more effective. However, beware, dying in Valheim will accrue a 5% decrease to your total level in each skill, which is quite a harsh penalty. This is actually one of the things that can be changed in your world settings when creating a world, but I was playing on the default settings as mentioned. Anyway, I explored up the side of the small mountain next next to me. It's funny looking back at this footage after having played so much. This area feels similar, but it's almost unrecognizable compared to what it looks like after my 100 hours of gameplay. Now, I found a log on the ground, which I attempted to punch, but that apparently did 0 damage. Immediately after, I found a stone, which actually unlocked 2 new recipes, which pop up whenever you acquire new materials. It turns out I could make torches as well as rag tunics. After struggling for a moment to find out how to open my inventory, I finally realized the tab key would bring up your inventory, as well as your crafting page, skills, and messages. Your inventory features 32 slots, of which 8 are keybindable, and you'll notice this weight symbol indicating that I can carry up to 300 in weight. A moment later, the crow reappeared and suggested that I look for stone as well as wood in order to make an axe, which would allow me to then chop trees and logs. I already had some stone, but wood I wasn't quite sure how to acquire without an axe. However, after running around a bit, I found a fallen branch, and this gave me exactly 1 wood. Nice. And this unlocked recipes for a stone axe, a club, and a hammer. So first I made the stone axe, which allowed me to chop these beech trees, and those already gave quite a bit more wood than just finding branches on the ground. And afterwards I made the hammer, which is really your key to the rest of the world. Your hammer is what you're going to use to make absolutely everything else, from fires to shelter to crafting stations to structures, to even being able to repair the things which you've already made. Next, I came across this much larger beech tree, which I began chopping, and as you'll notice, the log falls and takes some damage as it hits the ground. You then further split the huge log into 2 smaller logs, and once you chop those smaller logs, they turn into 10 wood. The tree mechanics in Valheim are actually pretty awesome. For example, if you chop a tree at the top of a mountain with a bunch of trees below it, you can start a sort of cascading effect where your chopped down trees will chop down other trees by running into them. However, you're going to want to make sure you're not standing anywhere near where you can get hit by a falling tree, because it can definitely kill you. Now, unfortunately, 1/2 of my 2 logs fell into the water, and because you can't use tools in water, I just tried to punch the log, which further pushed it deeper into this river. One thing to note here is that my stamina here is getting drained from swimming, and if it reaches 0, it will start draining your health. Also, trying to get up this hill with no stamina was fairly difficult. However, basically any hill or mountain is climbable, you just need to make sure you stop and rest in order for your stamina bar to refill before you try climbing more, which was a mechanic that was making an absolute fool of me currently. Now, once I finally got out of the water, I was rudely interrupted by this grayling. Luckily, with some of my wood, I had made a club, so I had a weapon to fight him off with. Combat is an action combat system where you can block and dodge and roll, as well as swing to attack. It's sort of like a Souls-like system, and combat can become exceptionally difficult in Valheim. However, you always start in the meadows biome like I'm in currently, and you'll mostly find these greylings as well as boars and deer, which aren't too dangerous. Now, as you can see, if a deer sees you, it will run away. There's a few ways to counter this, such as sneaking up or shooting them with a bow from the distance. The boars, however, are more aggressive, and they'll actually attack you first. I one-shot this boar, and he dropped some boar meat and leather scraps, which are both very useful items. Now, at this point, I decided I'll make a workbench. I figured this area will be perfect for my first base, and looking back on this, I'm sure it's the ultimate newbie move to make your first base literally right beside the sacrificial stones where you spawned in. But hey, I was a noob. Looking back on this, I wish I had found a more flat piece of land to make my first base, as dealing with hills and terrain is rather annoying while building, but voila, my workbench. And this opened up so many new recipes, the pop-ups would not stop coming in. I also created this cooking station, which looked like it probably needed a fire underneath it, so I put a fire underneath it. I needed some more wood to actually light the fire, and as you can see while cutting down these trees, the recipes just kept coming in. Everything from tools and bows and different armors to wooden structures like doors and flooring and roofing. At this point, I was already so excited to see what I could potentially build and create in this world. The possibilities were really starting to seem endless, and it created in me a sense of wonder that games often struggle to achieve, especially as I grow older and more jaded. I guess at this point, I was already pretty hooked. I made it back to my little camp and put the boar meat that I had onto the cooking station. Each cooking station features 2 hooks which you can attach raw meat onto. At first, I didn't quite understand how cooking worked, so I just left the boar meat there until I decided I might need food. This was a mistake because the meat actually cooks in about 20 seconds and you have to click the cooking station to grab the meat. Otherwise, if you leave it on for too long, the meat turns into charcoal. However, this can be a good way to acquire charcoal before gaining access to an item known as the kiln later on, which requires way more materials and things from other biomes. Next, I tried to use my workbench, but I was told that in order to actually craft with it, it needed a roof. Basically, with a workbench built, this allows you to build structures within a certain radius of the workbench. However, in order to actually use its crafting or repair functionality, it needs to have a roof with 70% coverage. So I got to work building first some walls around my workbench and eventually a roof. And this was my first building in Valheim. I would love to tell you all that as I played the game, I got better at building structures, making them appear more aesthetic and perhaps having better functionality, but honestly, I'm just not that great at building. And this game really humbled me in that fact. Trust me, later on I created some much larger buildings and utilized some much larger areas, but you know, they did what they were supposed to do. They didn't need to look pretty. Anyway, now that I could use my workbench, I made a hoe, which is a tool that allows you to level and raise the ground around you. This is really useful for flattening certain areas or creating paths, or even just getting rid of some grass. Using the hoe actually increased my farming skill as well, which is something we'll get into later on. Anyway, a while later I successfully cooked my first piece of boar meat, and as you can see, eating it greatly increased my health and stamina. In Valheim, you don't need food to necessarily survive. However, you generally always want to have 3 food buffs on because they just increase your regeneration rate and maximum health and stamina, which makes whatever you're doing in the world that much easier. Using my workbench, I was also able to make a storage chest, which just required 10 wood to create. There's basically no reason not to hold on to basically every item you find in Valheim because it's so easy to create storage. Though, bear in mind, it can be difficult to find room for all of your chests, and then even more difficult to remember what's in each of them. Trust me, you're gonna have a lot of chests. And next up, I made a bed, which would be awesome to help me sleep through the night. However, in order to actually sleep on the bed, it also needed a roof and needed to be covered. Once you do sleep, the game will progress you towards the next day, and it also sets your spawn. So anytime you sleep in a bed, then, if you die, you'll respawn back at the last bed you slept in. So I went to go gather some more wood to create a room for my bed, and as you can see, my axe actually ran out of durability. When this happens, your item doesn't get destroyed, but it does become unusable until you repair it at your workbench or forge or whatever crafting station you used to originally make the item. Luckily, repairing an item doesn't actually cost any materials, so you can do this whenever you're near your crafting station for free. Anyways, I made it to the next day and I realized that a ton of recipes required flint. I had actually seen some flint on my first day when I chopped that tree and it fell into the river, because flint generally spawns alongside water. While following the riverside and exploring and unlocking a bit more of the map, and mostly just gathering flint, I came across a boar and a greyling. Upon killing the boar, I received a boar trophy. Basically, every monster in the game can drop a trophy, which is essentially just its head. Some of these trophies have uses and other ones not so much. For example, boar trophies, I don't really know what the purpose of them is for, other than the fact that by the end of my playthrough, I think I had about 100 of them. Now, back at camp, you'll see in the crafting menu that certain items will have an orange star beside them. This indicates they can actually upgrade one of your workstations. For example, this chopping block will upgrade my workbench, meaning I'll have access to more recipes as well as the upgrade system. So I was able to create a flint knife as well as a flint spear, and in the upgrade menu, I was able to upgrade my axe, my hoe, and my hammer, which just makes them more effective and gives them a bit more durability. Now that I had my new spear, I felt a bit more confident going to explore a bit of the land around me. So I made my way west of my camp and I found some raspberry bushes. These are a great food item for stamina, and they're also required in a lot of recipes. Anytime you find these bushes or blueberry bushes or any sort of plant, it can be a good idea to mark them on the map, as they'll actually respawn, so you can come and gather more later. You'll notice this giant rock formation here looking somewhat like it's in the shape of a Viking grave. This will be important later on, but for now I had no idea it was even relevant, and I was more focused on what looked like a building in the distance. I was actually pretty surprised to see this, as I didn't expect there to be pre-built objects on the map. In the meadows in particular, you can find lots of buildings, and even farms with chests that have items to loot, or you can destroy these buildings if you want to take the supplies. And also, as is the case with this one, some of these buildings feature beehives. If you damage the beehives, the bees will come out and attack you. However, you can destroy it, which will give you a queen bee, which is an item that you can use to make your own beehives at your base in order to start farming honey. I didn't take this beehive out because it started dealing damage, but I made a mental note of the fact that it was here, and I figured I would come back when I had a bow or a better way to damage it. Now, as I wandered more west, I made my way into a more heavily forested area. I found these 4 boars, and my new spear made quick work of them, but I also came across this runestone. You'll find runestones at the entrance to new biomes that might explain or give relevant hints about said biome. See, this was the beginning of the Black Forest biome. which features more difficult enemies like grey dwarves and skeletons and even giant trolls. The Black Forest also features burial sites, which are small dungeons you can enter, as well as copper and tin. Now, I didn't know this at the time, obviously, but this was my first venture into a biome other than the meadows. I actually found this small little group of huts along the shore, but while there, 3 grey dwarves came after me. These are basically just the slightly stronger version of greylings. They can also use ranged attacks. And they drop an item known as Grey Dwarf Eyes, which is actually a really important part of a lot of different recipes later on, even being required to create portals. I made quick work of them, but it did kind of scare me a little bit, and so as it was beginning to get dark, I decided to make my way back to camp, where I finally slept for the night and woke up on day 3. Now, at this point, my base was really starting to come together, and I even began working on making an actual building for my home. Because it was on a hill, I decided to have a sort of raised platform that would be standing on these wooden poles, with some stairs to get inside. But I was going to need a lot more wood to actually finish this project, but at least we got a good start on it. Afterwards, while looking through my crafting menu, I noticed I could craft a raft, which would allow me to travel across water to get to other islands. However, I seriously could not figure out how to use it. There's a ladder to get on it, and once there, you can use the rudder to control it, and you can drop or raise the sail. However, the raft just didn't go anywhere. Trust me, later on I definitely figured out sailing, but for the time being I figured I didn't really have any good reason to travel to any further islands just yet, so I decided to wait for now. Instead, I got a bit better at my sneaking abilities in order to kill deer. At some point, I ran into my first skeleton, which completely scared the crap out of me, and I ran away as fast and far as possible. Which is hilarious because skeletons really aren't all that dangerous in Valheim, but this is the joys of being a noob. Anyway, after hunting enough deer, I was finally able to upgrade my armor. I'm in leather now, but it does increase my armor rating, and I still needed more deer hide for the leather helmet. At some point, I realized I could probably fit 2 cooking stations over my fire, so I tried it, and to my surprise, it actually worked. I could now cook 4 things at the same time. And actually, later on, I added a 3rd cooking station as well. I finally crafted a bow and made some flint head arrows to go along with it. The bow is easily one of the most useful weapons in the game, as it allows you to attack things from a distance. Or you can kite things as you run away, and even apply effects like fire or poison. Now, when you make the first bow, the crude bow, and your bow skill is only level 1, it's actually extremely inaccurate. It turns out you need to aim a bit high and to the right in order to actually hit your target. It's a bit of a learned skill, but you pick it up pretty quickly. Later on, and with better bows, this becomes less of an issue, especially at short distances. Now that I had the bow, I was actually able to take down that bee's nest we had seen prior, and I got the queen bee. At this point, I was ready to start working on my base and finally finish up my house. But unfortunate timing because it started raining, and because my fire was outside, the rain put out my fire. And because my fire is required for me to be in a resting state, which is required for me to sleep, I wasn't able to just sleep through the rainstorm. This basically doubled down my decision to work on my actual shelter, because I needed an inside fire that wouldn't go out when it was raining. So I got to work, in the rain. It was miserable. But the idea of having a roof over my head and being able to sleep was enough to drive me forward. Now, building in Valheim is pretty intuitive. As long as your structures have support, they will stay standing. You can apply support through beams or poles that are attached to the ground, or you can build off of other indestructible structures that exist within the world. Because I was just making a simple shelter, I wasn't really going to need too much support to keep this thing standing. However, if you want to see an object's level of support, you can mouse over it while holding the hammer. Green means it's well supported, yellow means it's not as well supported, and orange and red mean it could literally just fall down. While building walls, this didn't seem to be really too much of an issue, though I did struggle with roofing. If anyone has tips for roofs in Valheim and making them structurally sound, I would appreciate the advice. Anyway, I managed to get a couple of fires inside, and I was building a chimney for them so that the smoke goes out of the house. Because if smoke builds up inside, it can cause the smoke to debuff, which will make you constantly take damage. And then I began working on my roof. I don't think we're going to talk about my roof, or in fact any roofs that I create moving forward. Just know that they're kind of there. And they do the job, at least, of kind of keeping me covered. Sort of. But ultimately, this was my finished product, a cozy little place to call home for now. One thing I have to say is Valheim does cozy better than any other game I've played. You basically have this extremely scary world outside where you can die in seconds by making the wrong decision, or getting caught up in a storm, or venturing somewhere you shouldn't go just yet. But you can always come back home and enjoy your fire and cook some food and get indoors, and it just does cozy really, really well. But now, at this point, it was time that I start venturing out further. I wanted to fight the first boss and explore some of the Black Forest biome. I wanted to start getting some new weapons and resources to create new items. First off, I found this tower in the Black Forest, which I marked on my map, and these towers will often have Grey Dwarves defending them, and usually there's a loot chest or a barrel outside with supplies you can take. Marking things on your map is really important because it allows you to discover a bunch of areas and then to relocate them when you need to. I marked basically everything I came across, from berries and plants growing to certain ores or even dungeons and other points of interest. I finally made my way toward one of these burial dungeons. I killed a skeleton outside who dropped bone fragments, which unlocked a whole host of new recipes before heading inside. I found some glowing mushrooms, but I didn't make it too far before a skeleton, with a star next to his name, started attacking me. I didn't realize this at the time, but a star beside an enemy's name will indicate a certain level of difficulty for that mob. Normal mobs don't have any stars. Some mobs will have one star, like that skeleton, indicating it has more health and does more damage. And you can even find 2-star mobs that sometimes will have entirely different mechanics that you have to deal with, and they can be really difficult. However, the more stars that an enemy has, the more loot that it drops, so it's still beneficial to fight them. Anyway, I was still slightly scared of the closed space within the dungeon, so I made my way back to my base and decided to work on that a little bit more. I made the tanning rack, which upgraded my workbench to level 3, which allowed me to upgrade all of my armor and even to make some fire arrows. I wanted to try my hand at the first boss of the game, Eikthyr. So I looked on the map towards Eikthyr's altar and started making my way there, over a river, a ravine, and into some more meadows, but it turns out that in order to actually summon Eikthyr, I was going to need a few deer trophies. Luckily, from all my deer hunting, I had plenty left at my base. So I finally found my way to the altar with all of the required trophies, and I summoned Eikthyr. I really had no idea what to expect from this fight, and I was altogether ready to die immediately. Eikthyr is a sort of massive deer that uses electricity to attack you. He has an AoE electric attack, as well as a direct one. And he can also do a charge attack from a distance. However, luckily I brought my bow, because this made staying out of range from his attacks pretty easy. And the fire arrows constantly kept him on fire, dealing damage over time. This fight took me literally almost 5 minutes because, as you can see, his health is going down very slowly. I took some damage during the fight, but usually the time between me getting hit was enough time for my health to fully regenerate. The real issue was stamina, because not only did I use stamina to run away from Eikthyr, but you also use stamina whenever you're aiming down your bow. Towards the end of the fight, I actually ran out of fire arrows, and I only had a few normal arrows left in my inventory. And even worse than that, my bow actually ended up running out of durability. But fortunately, Eikthyr was only a few hits away from dying, so I ran up with my spear and finished him off. I was actually pretty happy with myself. I thought for sure I would die on the first attempt, but no. Eikthyr was pretty easy. Now, he drops 2 items, the Eikthyr trophy, as well as his hard antlers, which is an absolutely essential item in terms of progressing forward. So first off, when you kill any of the 7 bosses in Valheim, you can take their trophy to the sacrificial stones where you first spawned into the game, and you can hang their head on their corresponding stone, which will unlock a power. This power can be used every 20 minutes and has a duration of 5 minutes. The Eikthyr power reduces the stamina cost of running and jumping, which would have been really useful in that fight, if I'm being honest. But the best part here is the hard antlers can be used to create your first pickaxe, which will allow for the mining of copper, tin, and stone, and later on things like iron and silver. The pickaxe is also pretty unique because it allows you to dig farther down into the terrain than you actually can with your hoe. So if you wanted to dig a really deep trench or just a really deep hole, you can do that. It allows you to terraform much easier. But this is when I learned that Valheim is also split up into ages, sort of like ages of technology. Whereas before I was dealing with mostly stone and wood and leather, I was now propelled into the Bronze Age, because of my newfound ability to mine copper and tin, which I could smelt into bronze. Apparently, this is considered the first real grind you come across in Valheim, because in order to get all of the bronze items and upgrades that you need, you're gonna need a metric ton of copper and tin. Now, you need 2 copper ore and 1 tin ore in order to create a bronze bar. According to the internet, when you first hit the Bronze Age, in order to upgrade everything, you're basically going to want about 250 bronze, meaning 500 copper and 250 tin. So there's going to be a lot of mining in my future. Also, remember that strange rock formation that we passed by earlier? Well, these are designed in the shape of a Viking grave, and whenever you see rock formations like this in the meadows, you should dig into them. Now that I had a pickaxe, I was actually able to do so, and there's always one treasure chest hidden underneath these. These treasures can hold valuable items like rubies or amber or coins or silver necklaces, which can all be sold to traders later on. We'll get into all of that when the time comes, and honestly, right now I didn't understand the value of these items, but I thought the whole Viking grave thing was pretty cool. Now, in order to actually smelt copper and bronze, I needed to make a smelter and a kiln. Both of those recipes require something known as surtling cores. The easiest way for me to get surtling cores is apparently those burial dungeons, the ones that I had ran out of prior. But now that I had taken down a literal boss, I was feeling slightly more confident, and so I made my way back to the burial chambers. The 1-star skeleton was still waiting for me, sure enough, and although it took quite some time to actually get him down, he really didn't do too much damage. Now, similar to the world outside, these dungeons are randomly generated. They're a sprawling maze of doors and mobs in different rooms with chests and loot, and usually 1 or 2 rooms which also contain between 3 and 5 surtling cores. In order to make one of each the smelter and the kiln, I was going to need 10 in total. Unfortunately for me though, while winding my way through this dungeon, I came across a ghost, which is probably the hardest hitting mob that can spawn inside these burial chambers. I sort of kited this ghost back to the entrance, but then a skeleton also joined in, and I tried just spamming attack to see if I could kill them both, but I finally died for the first time. Now, upon death, you're spawned completely naked without any of your items at your bed. It's actually nice to have a chest full of some older items, and especially food, in order to help you make it back to your body without dying. Your body and all of its loot will spawn a gravestone wherever you died, and upon returning you can loot everything you had. Also, I got that 5% reduction to all of my skills, which definitely sucks, but it's not as much of a setback as I thought it might be, especially at this early point in the game. Luckily, I made it back to the grave unscathed, and I was able to loot all of my items. I continued through the dungeon, fighting what seemed like hordes of skeletons. That's because there was an actual skeleton spawner, which I also had to destroy in order to get them to stop spawning. But I finally did make it to the end of the dungeon and managed to find 3 surtling cores. So I still needed 7 more, but this was a good start. And now really began the Bronze Age grind for me. I began exploring further and further into the map. I found this small village. I dug down in this rock formation to see if there was any chest down here, but apparently there wasn't, so I just dug a deep hole for no reason. I also found these crashed ships while searching for tin ore, which always spawns near the shore, and by digging into these ships, I actually did find a chest with some loot. Later on, I stumbled upon another black forest to the north, past my Eikthyr altar, and I almost died to some skeletons who were shooting at me. I then found the most pointless chest location of all time. In order to get this, I had to actually destroy the entire structure around it. I finally found another burial location, and I died again. Great. It was worth it though, because I was able to get 5 more cores, which means I didn't have enough to make both the kiln and the smelter, but I could at least make one of them. And here's a quick look at the skills that I had acquired so far. My highest level skill was in spears at 27, with running at 25, following closely behind. Every single skill actually goes all the way up to level 100, believe it or not. Now, the next day I placed my charcoal kiln, which could turn wood into charcoal, which is then used in the smelter to turn ores into bars. Exploring deeper into the Black Forest biome, I ended up fighting a Grey Dwarf Brute, which was not an easy fight at all. But I managed to take him down, and he actually dropped some ancient seeds, which is an item that we're going to need later on. I also stumbled into a troll cave. I definitely wasn't ready to fight any trolls just yet. My bow did almost no damage, so I decided to stay cautious and just run out. At this point, it felt like my map was actually starting to become pretty expansive, or so I thought. This is probably less than a single % of the entire world showing right here. But it still takes me about 5 minutes to run from the top of my map to the bottom. I can't stress enough how big this game actually is. Anyway, after tons of exploration, tons of burial chambers, exploring through towers and vast swaths of the Black Forest biome, I finally had all the surtling cores required to actually make my smelter. And I was finally able to create bronze armor, upgrades, tools, and even new crafting stations such as the Forge, which allows you to actually work with bronze. I could make mead kettles and brewing stations in order to start crafting my own potions. I could make a cart, which would help with carrying items, which, in hindsight, I definitely underutilized. And all in all, I was ready to begin the massive amount of mining that was required to get all the bronze I needed. So I mined copper, I mined tin, like for hours I did this, running all the way back to my base, and then back north to the Black Forest, and then back to my base again. I upgraded my armor to full bronze and created the cultivator tool, which you could actually use to essentially create your own farm. So behind my house, I leveled out an area and cultivated the ground where I was actually able to plant carrot seeds and grow carrots, which would help with other cooking recipes in the future. Apparently, you can find other seeds and grow different plants as well, and you can even replant trees, which is something we're going to have to try later on. While I was looking through things I could potentially craft, I found this bone tower shield, which is made up of skeleton trophies and bone fragments, which actually looked super cool. It was probably the coolest piece of equipment I actually crafted during my entire time playing. Unfortunately, it's not actually all that great of a shield, and it ends up getting replaced pretty quickly. There are two different types of shields in Valheim, tower shields and bucklers. Tower shields allow for a little bit more block damage, but decreased mobility, whereas bucklers allow you to move around a bit more freely and also enable you to parry enemy attacks. Now, at some point while making my first bronze pickaxe, I got this message across my screen, saying the forest is moving. This is never a fun message to see because this means you're currently getting raided, where enemies will start spawning on and around your base, attacking your buildings and crafting stations and you. Now, because so far I had only defeated one boss, the enemies I had to deal with were just Grey Dwarves. A Grey Dwarf Brute, which was the most difficult, a couple of Grey Dwarf Shamans, which can actually AoE heal the rest of them, and then a bunch of just normal Grey Dwarves. According to the Valheim wiki, every 46 minutes there's a 20% chance that your base gets raided. Interestingly enough, I actually only had this happen twice in my entire time playing. I think because you have to generally be near your base for this chance to happen, and so much of my time spent playing was spent exploring or looking for certain items away from my base. However, apparently once you have defeated more bosses, the difficulty level of these raids and the monsters and mobs that come after you increase. So for every boss you kill, these raids become more deadly. I guess this is to incentivize you to actually create some defensive barriers around your base and home. Anyway, it took me a few minutes, but eventually I managed to take on all of the Grey Dwarves, and everything was back to normal. Either way, if you're in your base, I highly recommend pausing the game instead of going AFK. I'm not too sure how this works if you're playing with multiple people, but I'm assuming going AFK in your base can be quite risky either way. Anyway, back to the daily grind of mining every piece of copper that exists. The bronze pickaxe was actually quite a huge upgrade. It smashed through the copper much faster than my previous antler pickaxe. When I made it back to my base, my carrots were actually finished growing and I was able to harvest all of them. Furthermore, you can actually replant a carrot in order to turn it into a carrot seed plant to get more carrot seeds. Every 1 carrot you plant will result in 3 carrot seeds. Also, I was finally able to upgrade my bow from the crude bow to a fine wood bow. You see, because now that I had a bronze axe, I was able to chop birch trees, which result in fine wood, a more specific and harder to acquire type of wood that's used to make lots of different recipes like this better bow, as well as furnitures and portals. Yes, I said portals. After looking through the crafting menu, I finally found portals, which require 20 fine wood, 10 Grey Dwarf eyes, and another 2 of those Surtling cores. Portals work in an interesting way in Valheim. Basically, an empty portal here that is not connected to another portal somewhere else is just a piece of furniture. Once you place a portal, you can leave the tag blank, or you can enter a tag, and when you place another portal, it will either connect to your original blank portal, or if you give it a tag, for example, Portal 1, it will then connect with whatever other portal has that exact same tag. This was going to be an absolute game changer for me, because instead of having to run the entire way from the Black Forest biome I was currently exploring all the way back to my base, I could just teleport. Or so I thought. So I ran pretty far north until I was just outside the Black Forest biome, and I actually found this nice little spot which had 2 opposing sort of huts, and I figured this would be a good place to make a second sort of base. Nothing too fancy, I just wanted another place that was fenced in with a workbench and a fire and a portal for easy access to come back here. So first I placed my portal and had to check if it worked, and voila. Fast travel was going to be so insanely handy. This has honestly been the best and biggest upgrade thus far, allowing me to get around much quicker. Because let me tell you, just running everywhere in Valheim is definitely time consuming. But then I picked up some bronze in front of my smelter back at my base, and I tried to teleport again when I got the dreaded message. An item prevents you from teleporting. Okay. As it turns out, you can't actually go through a portal when you're carrying any sort of metal. So any ores or any bars, and basically the entire reason I wanted to use my portal was now invalid. Well, not completely, because I can still use it to travel back to the Black Forest quickly once I had deposited all of the copper and tin that I had been mining. It essentially cuts my travel time in half. And there's plenty more use for portals besides just transporting metal. For example, I could chop different types of trees in the Black Forest, or go delving into some more burial chamber dungeons, and basically everything I acquired there, I would still be able to teleport with. Anyway, I've finished making up my second little base, if you can even call it that, more of an outpost with a few chests, and eventually got back to the mining grind. I made my first sword because until you have access to bronze, you don't actually have access to any swords, and this became my main weapon for the foreseeable future. And finally I had enough bronze to start working on my brewery, which included the mead kettle where you actually mix the ingredients. but you also need to make a fermenter system where you place the mead into to ferment. This can actually take quite some time. Apparently it's 2 in-game days to actually ferment just one batch. So having multiple fermenters in the future is probably something I'd want to look into. And I actually made a small building for my brewing station because the mead kettle has to be placed on top of a fire. I only had access to a few recipes such as minor health and stamina, which would already be such a big help, but also a poison resistance potion and a tasty mead base, which basically would lower your health regen in order to increase your stamina regen. So it's probably good when you're out mining or woodcutting or doing something that mostly requires just stamina. Next, while looking through my crafting menu at my workbench, I noticed I could make something known as the Stag Breaker. It's basically a giant 2-handed hammer made up of 5 deer trophies and a bunch of wood and leather. It's actually a pretty awesome item that allows you to deal AoE damage to a bunch of enemies in front of you. I didn't get the chance to use it too often, but when I did, it was very satisfying. Now, unfortunately, I somehow missed recording myself finding the second Vegvisir. I was entering some burial chambers in order to get more Surtling cores for portals when I came across another one of those runestones that would indicate where the next boss was located. I now had the Elder marked on my map, and to me this seemed like an impossible distance away. But either way, I figured it was time to start exploring some more and start expanding the map and getting a bit of a better idea of how I'm going to get to the Elder boss. I mean, at this point, I had basically gotten all of the upgrades out of bronze that I wanted. There were still a few things, but to be honest, I was just a bit sick of mining. So I crossed a nearby river and I made it onto another landmass. Immediately, I noticed this one seemed to have snow. And upon walking a bit further up this mountain, I was introduced to another biome, the mountain. I had a feeling this was not the place I was supposed to be just yet, as I immediately started taking tick damage from being cold. Which leads me to think I probably need some warm clothing or something to actually start exploring this biome. But it seemed like I wouldn't really be able to explore in this direction, at least not on land, anyway. So I thought I would wait and pick things up the next day and try to figure out how to use my raft, or to travel on water in some way that I can get around this island and towards the Elder boss. Well, the next day I was raided again. This was actually the final time that I was raided in this entire playthrough. However, this time I was completely caught off guard. I was just trying to brew some potions before setting out. I hadn't eaten any food, so my health was considerably low, and I had some close calls. This time there were actually 2 Grey Dwarf brutes, and the shamans were getting heals off exceptionally fast. But luckily, I managed to take them all out without dying. Now, today, I still wanted to figure out traveling on my raft, so that I could actually make my way east on the map. But I realized when looking through my crafting menu that I actually had a new boat I could make, the Carve. I figured since my raft was so ridiculously challenging to use prior, this newer boat upgrade might be a good thing to work towards. I needed 30 fine wood, 10 deer hide, 20 resin, and 80 bronze nails. Not really too bad. But I also figured that if I was going to have multiple boats or ships, I might work on creating a bit of a dock, since actually getting onto my raft and getting it into the water was actually a challenge before. And I would imagine that's only exacerbated with bigger and bigger ships. So a simple dock seemed like a good idea, and when it was all said and done, it was nothing special, but it would work for the time being. Now, in order to get the bronze nails to create the Carve, I, of course, had to go mining a bit more. Not for much, but a little bit. And I stumbled across my first troll out in the wild. These guys are massive, and as you can see, do a ton of damage. But I figured using my fire arrows and bow, I would try and kite the troll backwards as they seem to move pretty slowly. This took quite some time, I'm not gonna lie, but the troll was dead and actually ended up dropping some troll hide, which gave me the recipe for some new troll hide armor, which looked to be more akin to leather armor or something that would work well with a ranger build. Considering how much I was starting to use my bow, this was definitely an armor set that I wanted to look into. Upon further research, apparently the trollhide armor provides decent armor, but also doesn't reduce movement speed the way my bronze armor currently did. And also, it provided a set bonus of plus 15 to your sneak level, whenever you're wearing all 4 pieces. When I finally had all of my items together to create my new boat, I noticed that my potions actually finished fermenting, and I got my hands on my first health potions, which would be so useful in the future. Basically, they massively increase your health regeneration for a short period of time. But every time you use a specific potion, that potion will go on cooldown for a 2-minute period. Anyway, it was finally time. I crafted the Carve, a real boat. Surely sailing in this bad boy will be much easier, right? Right? Basically, sailing in Valheim works like this. You get on your boat and you sit on your rudder and you can control the sail to either go up or down, and when it's down, obviously the wind will push you. I was still blissfully unaware of how the wind mechanic worked at this time, but if you take a look at my minimap, the wind is pushing me in the exact opposite direction that I was trying to go. When the wind is pushing against you in Valheim, your best bet is to raise your sail all the way up and sort of just wiggle left and right through the water, and you're going to move really slowly, but eventually the wind will change direction and help propel you forward. I wish I could tell you all that I figured this out in just a couple of minutes, but honestly, I was sat in my boat pretty close to my dock for about 10 minutes, just trying to figure out how to move. It was a complete embarrassment. With that being said, as you'll see through the rest of my sailing adventures, the wind was literally always going the exact wrong way I needed it to actually go. I got stuck out in the waters many, many times. Apparently later on in the game, you can actually fight a boss, which grants you a power to control the wind from time to time, but right now, it's a total pain. However, I finally got it going, and sailing in Valheim is a really unique experience. You're on this small boat fighting through waves and wind, and you basically have all your important belongings on you, and if you die, your chances of getting your things back are slim to none. There are sea creatures, massive dangerous biomes in the distance, and due to the fog of war, you never really know how close or far away from the land you actually are. For some reason, all of that creates this really unique atmosphere where you're always kind of worried, but you're also really excited to push forward. But you have to be careful. You can even end up in storms like this one, where the waves get pretty violent and it can actually damage your boat. Luckily, the boats seem to have quite a decent amount of durability as long as you remember to repair them wherever you land and set up a workbench. Anyway, I finally found another landmass. Even though it felt like I was traveling south for an exceptionally long time, I really hadn't gone too far. This seemed to be another meadows biome, so I wasn't too concerned about running into anything too dangerous. However, not far from the shore, I already ran into another mountain. These mountain biomes are quite massive, it seems, so I already knew I had a mountain to my east, as well as to the south of my spawn at this point. So I sort of came up with a plan. I decided to sail back home and work on getting Smelting cores so that when I travel I could create more portals and start creating a sort of portal network as I traveled farther and farther out into the world. Another thing I wanted to work on was creating that troll hide armor. A friend of mine who has played this game before didn't want to give me any spoilers, however he mentioned that having some extra mobility for the Elder boss fight would be a good idea. So I killed another troll. I was going to need quite a bit of troll hide to actually not only create the armor but also upgrade it. And also, I found some more Smelting cores. My first portal was ready to go, so I set sail again to that southern island, and this time I decided to run along the left side of the landmass to hopefully dodge that giant mountain. This mostly worked, and at some point I actually stumbled upon another Eikthyr altar, the altar from the first boss. I guess there are multiple altars for each of the bosses located throughout the world, not just the one that you get designated. While traveling alongside the mountain, I came across this view, which was actually kind of insane. I didn't realize how high up and how much verticality the mountain biome actually has, but yeah, this goes pretty high. And this is what my map looked like so far. As I ran down and around the mountain, most of the region has been a black forest biome, so there was lots of copper and towers and burial dungeons along the way. And all the way at the very bottom of this venture, I found myself in a brand new biome, the swamp, with a draugr in the distance. This scared the crap out of me at the time because I didn't really realize that in terms of progression, the next biome I would likely venture into after the Black Forest was the swamp. I assumed because it looked rather scary that it was an endgame biome and I didn't really want to venture much farther. So way down here and right outside the swamp is where I decided to build a little hut and place my first portal. That way I could make it back here whenever needed. I tagged the portal South 1, and I can already imagine how confusing it could be trying to remember where every portal goes, especially when you really start expanding the world and having a massive network of portals. Anyway, I decided to head back to my boat, and instead of traveling back home, I just decided to travel in basically a straight line towards the Elder spawn, to see what happens. I found this small little crevice sort of between two land masses that I was able to pass through, and honestly, I was absolutely cooking. We were flying with the wind at our back. And after quite a bit of sailing, as you can see from my map here, I think I finally found the landmass where the Elder altar was located. Also, there seemed to be some sort of bag icon here. The crow at the beginning of the game explained to me when I found coins that I could use them at traders. So I'm assuming this icon indicated a trader, which it did. You can see this sort of translucent bubble around the trader's locations, and it means that enemies won't be able to follow you inside. These areas can actually be really useful as they have a fire and a small amount of shelter that you can use to get your rested buff. There are different traders with different locations all around the world, but this is the first one I found, and he has a ton of useful items. Like, this is an extremely important part of your progression. Some of the items he sells includes a cosmetic hat, a headpiece that acts as a permanent light source, barrel rings which allows you to craft barrels, a fishing rod and bait to allow you to start the fishing skill, but also, and for me most importantly, a belt known as the Megingjord, I think, which increases your maximum carry weight by 150, so a 33% upgrade, which is actually insane, but it does cost 950 coins. Now, if you remember, coins are acquired from dungeons and chests and various loot, but also, as mentioned earlier, you can get amber and amber pearls and rubies and silver necklaces, which you can then sell to the trader for coins as well. I figured this would be a really good spot to place a portal, that way I could get back here quickly if I ever needed to buy anything. And also, I could sell all of my tradable items that I had acquired so far, which was actually a decent amount. I had about 13 rubies, a silver necklace, 10 amber pearls, and 24 amber, not to mention 456 coins. I hoped that this was enough to get the inventory expansion, and after selling everything, I literally had just enough. I needed 950 and had 966. Perfect. Now, anytime I did any sort of gathering, especially mining, because it can't be transported between portals, I would now be 33% more efficient. I was very excited about this. Anyway, after finishing with the trader, I continued my way forth towards the Elder Spawn location. This was a black forest, but it somehow seemed more dangerous than other black forests I had been in. There were monster spawns basically everywhere. It didn't help that it was also dark out now. But eventually, after crossing a small river and some fields, I came to the Elder Spawn location. This platform with a fire pit in the middle and seemingly 4 pillars around it. I had no delusions that this fight was going to be as easy as Eikthyr. I didn't know what to expect, but I wanted to make sure that before I tried to fight this boss, I was actually prepared. First off, similar to Eikthyr, I was going to need an item to actually summon the boss. In the case of the Elder, it was those ancient seeds, which are dropped by the Grey Dwarf brutes. Luckily, because of the raids on my spawn, I actually had plenty of those. But I also wanted a fully upgraded bow, plenty of fire arrows, and a fully upgraded set of trollhide armor. I had no idea if a bow was the best weapon for this boss, but it worked so well with Eikthyr and on trolls that it was by far my favorite weapon at the moment. So I made my trek back home, and I went back to that troll cave that I had found much earlier. Yeah, that's still not happening. So instead, I decided to find trolls out in the open. I got one down and... is that troll hair coming out of his ass? I stood quite close so I could inspect. I killed another and yeah, I'm pretty sure that's troll hair coming out of his ass. I had to kill one more just to make sure and be absolutely certain that there was a ton of troll hair coming out of trolls' asses, and upon extremely close and attentive inspection, indeed, that is troll hair coming out of a troll ass. Anyway, I made my full set of troll armor, which actually looked pretty cool. I was definitely feeling like more of a ranger, and it was a breath of fresh air to get out of the bronze armor, which reduced my movement speed so much. Sure, I was going to be a little bit squishier, but so far I found in Valheim that if you're taking damage, you're probably already making a mistake. At least so far that seemed to be the case, so I'd rather have more mobility. I was far from finished, however, as I still wanted to upgrade this troll armor more. So I killed another troll, and this time he died in the water, meaning I couldn't get his troll hide, which was a bummer. If anyone knows how to gather items after they fall in water, please let me know. At some point, while taking a break from killing trolls, I realized I had somehow missed a pretty vital upgrade within the Bronze Age, and that is a cauldron. I had been wondering how I was supposed to cook better healing food, so I took my southern portal to go mine tin before remembering that I can't take tin through a portal. I'm an idiot. But eventually I had enough tin and copper for my cauldron, and that unlocked 5 more recipes, including deer stew, boar jerky, and carrot soup, and a few others, and these were all massive upgrades, increasing my health and stamina far up into the hundreds when combining all 3 of these consumables. Anyway, I tried finding some more trolls. At this point, I had at least upgraded my entire trollhide set to level 2, but I figured what was one gear upgrade really going to matter? I figured it's time. Let's try and fight the Elder. So I began my preparation, making sure I had plenty of food and their buffs, making sure I had health potions, fire arrows, my ancient seeds to actually summon the Elder, and finally I made my way there. I took down the portal that I had placed beside the trader and moved it so that it was closer to the Elder spawn. That way if I was dying lots, I would be able to respawn and get my stuff fairly quickly. But eventually, I was ready. I summoned the Elder and... holy shit. Your entire screen takes on a sort of reddish hue, and the Elder is a 20-foot tall sort of tree monster. I'm assuming he's like the boss of the Grey Dwarves. Which, in hindsight, it seems like fire arrows were the perfect answer. He's literally made of wood. Now, the Elder has a few different attacks, and it was immediately apparent why these 4 pillars exist. They are indestructible and make great places to hide from his first attack, where he sends out these sort of magical vines, which do quite a bit of damage. But you can always hide behind the pillar to block these. Afterwards, he summons a bunch of roots from the ground, which I didn't really know how to avoid, so I kinda just ran around sporadically. It seems he basically only places these on one half of the arena, so if you can make it to the other side, you can avoid them before they really hit you. And finally, I believe he has a melee attack as well, but as long as you're keeping your distance, he won't hit you. So I basically spent the next few minutes running from pillar to pillar and trying to keep the fire debuff applied at all times. It really wasn't all that different from the Eikthyr fight, honestly, he just had quite a bit more health. I think in total this fight took about 7 minutes, but I didn't really have any close calls. In fact, I would say this fight was actually easier than the first boss. But I also think this time I was just more prepared, both in gear and armor and weapons, but also just a bit more experience having played the game for around 50 hours at this point. Defeating the Elder drops the Elder Trophy, so you can get a new Forsaken Power, as well as something known as the Swamp Key, which was the first moment that made me realize the next biome that I would probably be exploring was the swamp. I was so happy to have the Elder finished, and I sacrificed his trophy back at the spawn stones, and I was granted a new power. This Elder power gives you faster woodcutting. While I thought that might be beneficial, I still think the Eikthyr power was more beneficial for the time being, so I kept that one on for now. Anyway, next, I made my way back to the Elder platform because I wanted to see if that fire was still going, despite me having killed the boss. And it was. It's basically a permanent, non-destructible fire. And I figured these 4 pillars around here would make a great spot to build off of. So I decided to make sort of a second base of operations at the Elder spawn. Apparently this is quite a popular idea that a lot of people do, however I wouldn't recommend doing this in a multiplayer server, as your friends could literally take some ancient seeds and spawn the Elder in your base. Which is kinda hilarious, but also kinda diabolical. Anyway, like I mentioned previously, I'm not a great builder, but I was getting better. I spent a few hours working on this. I'll mostly just fast forward through the building process. I made a bottom floor as well as a second floor with some cordwood beams and logs to provide better support. I attempted to make a roof even using beams to try and give it more support and ultimately failed. I could not figure out how to make an entire closed roof, so I just gave up. Because really, if you never looked up while you were on the second floor, would you really know the roof isn't finished? Of course not. But here is the finished product, my Elder base. Now, in reality, to actually create a fully functioning second base that's as productive as your home base, you're going to need a forge and a workbench and all of the upgrades that come along with them. The smelters and kilns and fermenters and everything I had back home. And I wasn't really interested in grinding for all of that again. So I didn't really use this base as often as I still used my spawn base, but it was a great start, and something that I could eventually upgrade in the future. But what I really wanted to do now was continue to explore. You see, in a survival game like Valheim, your progression is going to rely heavily on your curiosity. For me, a typical RPG player, I tend to take the safest route whenever possible. As you can see, I was probably over-prepared for the Elder fight, honestly. And that's how I generally like to play games. But in Valheim, sometimes you can surprise yourself. Sometimes you might find something that you think is too difficult or too dangerous, but as you venture forth, you realize you can actually handle it. And since the Elder dropped the swamp key, and I had already been to the swamp very briefly, and I had a portal very close to it, I decided to explore the swamp biome. So I teleported to my portal South 1 and made my way into the swamp. A skeleton chased after me, I swiftly dispatched him. I noticed a leech in the water, but they can't make it on land, but the swamp is filled with water, so you constantly run into these guys. I shot another skeleton with my bow before locking eyes with the Draugr. These guys deal pretty considerable damage, but they also don't have much health, so I was able to take him out and got a new item. Entrails. However, the leeches started attacking me, which granted me a poison debuff, and another Draugr started chasing me, so I tried to run back to my house, which I made it with 21 HP. However, unfortunately, out of nowhere, I was attacked by this blob, which re-poisoned me, and ultimately, I died. So, you remember my whole speech about curiosity? Yeah, well, I literally went into the swamp for 30 seconds, and I was already dead. Anyway, I got my stuff back, and despite all odds, continued to push forward into the swamp. And I started getting the hang of it. Basically, there's a lot more enemies in the swamp than in the Black Forest biome. In the Black Forest, you can basically move through there without really fighting anything. But that's not the case with the swamp. You're constantly going to be getting attacked by Draugr, skeleton, blobs, surtlings, and other more dangerous enemies. I was already realizing how handy one of those poison resistance potions would be here, as so many mobs can apply poison here, which really ticks for a lot of damage and lasts for a long time. While I was in the swamp, I stumbled across a tree which had a guck sack. And upon destroying the guck sack, I was rewarded with guck. Okay. A few moments later, I noticed the ground was shaking and I looked back to see, oh god, an abomination. I shot it with a fire arrow, which did like literally no damage, and decided, okay, it's time to run. Luckily, the abomination gets caught up in a lot of trees since it's so large that it's actually pretty easy to avoid if you run into these guys. But then I noticed something shiny on the ground, a muddy scrap pile. So I mined it and I received my first piece of iron. I was officially into the Iron Age. Now, for those of you who have played this game for a while, you'll know that stumbling across a random iron in the swamp is definitely not the most efficient way for you to gather iron. However, to me as a new player, I thought this was the only way to gather iron. So I began running around the swamp looking for more of those muddy scrap piles, but really couldn't find any more. It seemed like it was quite a rare occurrence, and it only resulted in me having 3 pieces of iron. Also, after just running a short distance, the swamp quickly turned back into a black forest, which was slightly strange to me. It seemed like out of all the biomes I had visited so far, the swamp is one of the smaller ones. Meadows and black forests can span vast and long fields and distances, but this was really quite a small swamp. And at this point, I reached a bit of a standstill for a bit. The swamp I had found was exceptionally small, and I only found 1 bit of iron I could mine. In order to get this all the way back to my base, I would first have to sail my boat all the way down south and then go back, for just 3 pieces of iron. So I put my iron in a chest near my portal and went back home. I began sailing and exploring further into the map in order to try and find more swamps or more interesting biomes. My map was really starting to feel a lot more fleshed out at this point, despite still having only discovered a very small percentage of the actual game. I figured I'm not finding anything new, really, so I decided to sail my boat to where my iron was placed in that chest. And of course, the wind was against me. But eventually I made it down there. I decided before heading back I'll delve into the swamp a bit more, and while I was there I realized that the trees were actually a different kind of tree. Ancient trees. And while chopping these down you can get ancient bark, which is used again in a ton of different recipes and crafting. I actually ended up fighting a 1-star troll in the swamp, which I don't think trolls actually spawn in swamps, but because the swamp is surrounded by black forest, this guy somehow got pulled in. I managed to take him down, but unfortunately a bit later, while surrounded by blobs and draugr, I died again. Either way, I made my way back. I got some of the new items to my boat, which actually has a small storage system, which I didn't realize previously. I pushed off and began to make the long journey back home. Along the way, a sea serpent began chasing me, which scared the crap out of me, but he really didn't do too much damage, and I was able to stop along a shoreline and place a workbench in order to repair my boat. I really didn't want to lose the small amount of iron that I had found, but eventually I made my way back home, and I smelted my first piece of iron, which opened up, once again, a ridiculous amount of recipes. Not only a ridiculous amount of recipes, but an utterly insane amount of iron was required for most of these craftable things. It seemed like the base amount of iron to make most things was 20, including all the armor, the weapons, the shields, the forge and its upgrades, and plenty of furniture and building upgrades as well. Basically, everything required a ton of iron. Now, you have to realize at this point, I've explored extensively the one swamp that I've found, and in that time I've found 3 iron. I already spent about 20 hours of gameplay farming copper and tin for bronze, which had way less building requirements than iron does, and those resources are extremely common. At this point, I really was lost, and I had no idea what to do. So I decided to Google it. How do you get iron efficiently in Valheim? And, oh, remember the swamp key? That is literally the key to iron. You see, in swamps, they have a random chance of spawning something known as a sunken crypt. In order to access these crypts, you need a swamp key. The swamp that I had found was unfortunately a rather small one, so there were no sunken crypts inside. So now I at least had a goal and a path set. We needed to find more swamps, find sunken crypts, and get lots of iron, and upgrade everything, and hopefully find out how to locate the 3rd boss. Let's go. The first place I found exploring was the plains, where something called a death skeeto came after me and took out over half my HP with 1 hit. Luckily, I was able to run away, and at least now I know where a plains biome is located when I come to that point. A little while later, I actually did stumble across another swamp, and I died immediately. But while back at home, I made another fermenter and I got myself some poison resistance potions, and finally made it back to that swamp where I killed some leeches which drop something known as a blood bag, which is actually an ingredient used for frost resistance potions, which is probably how you explore the mountain biome. I really do find it so cool how in Valheim you stumble across new items and new materials, and those just open doors for you in terms of your progression. Anyway, in this swamp, I finally found my first sunken crypt. Now, there were a ton of enemies outside of the crypt, so I decided to run as fast as I could in order to avoid them to get inside of the crypt, where there were also a ton of enemies. including this Draugr elite, but luckily because you're on a raised platform, they can't actually attack you. Now, crypts are pretty similar to burial dungeons, but they have more loot and a few different challenges. You'll find Draugr spawners and tons of blobs, as well as skeletons and their spawners as well. There are lots of different rooms in these crypts, most are waterlogged, and some areas you'll actually have to swim to access. But most of these rooms are covered with muddy scrap piles, which, if you remember, is what I actually found when I first mined iron in the swamp. These muddy scrap piles drop iron and also leather scraps and an item known as withered bones. Throughout these sunken crypts, you'll find chests with large amounts of iron, bones, sellable loot, and even things like poison arrows. I did end up dying again, unfortunately, while exploring this first crypt, and it was quite the venture to make it back while naked, but I managed to do it. Now, one more important thing to note is that iron is exceptionally heavy. Every piece of iron takes up 10 units of weight within your inventory. My max carry weight is only 450, and that's with the belt upgrade. So even if I was carrying absolutely nothing except for iron, I would only be able to carry 45 pieces. But unlike bronze, in order to actually turn iron into iron bars, it's only a 1-to-1 ratio. However, according to my previous calculations, if I wanted all the upgrades that I actually wanted, I was going to need like hundreds of iron. Not like 200 or 300, but closer to 500 iron. So I was in and out of this crypt about 4 different times due to my inventory being full, and to be honest, this was an extremely lucrative crypt. Not all of them contain even close to this amount, but I managed to get 70 plus pieces of iron back to my boat and into its storage. It wasn't a lot, but it was a start. So I sailed the entire way back home, once again fending off a sea serpent, and began smelting my iron into bars. Although I now had about 70 bars of iron, the cost of iron to actually craft things was so steep that I needed to make sure I spent these first 70 bars on exactly the right things. One of the first things I needed to build was a ship upgrade, the Longship. I'm assuming it would have more storage than the Carve, and if I was going to be traveling back and forth between swamps carrying massive amounts of iron, the more storage was going to become necessary. In order to craft this ship, I needed 100 iron nails, which is equal to 10 iron bars. Some deer hide and fine wood, but also 40 of that ancient bark you get from the trees in the swamp. So I crafted my iron nails, but also made myself an iron buckler and an iron sword, because the sunken crypts seem to have a lot of close-ranged melee combat, which was not so easy to deal with just using a bow. I also made myself the iron axe since I was going to go chop more ancient trees right away, which I did. And eventually I had all the materials required for my longship. And holy ship. They weren't kidding when they said longship. This thing is absolutely massive. And look at the storage. This thing has 18 slots. If I found enough sunken crypts, I could literally fit 540 iron inside this boat. This was exactly what I needed. Now, before I went out exploring more crypts, I decided to head back to the trader in order to sell some things to see if I could get the fishing rod and test out fishing, which I did, and fishing basically works like this. You cast your rod into some water where you can see the fish swimming around, and when one of them bites, you hold down right-click to pull it in. It's really not so easy. I failed every time while trying to fish. And actually, one time I just had my line in the water waiting for a fish to bite, and another fish felt so bad that it literally sacrificed itself and just jumped onto the land beside me where I was able to pick it up. I literally never caught a fish in my entire time playing this game, but I did have fish, a pike, because he just jumped onto the ground beside me. Feeling rather defeated, I decided it's time for more swamps. And so I set sail. The first time sailing on the longboat felt fantastic. I mean, the wind was still against me as normal, but once I had the wind at my back, we were able to travel pretty fast. I actually stumbled across this random island in the ocean which had something known as abyssal barnacles, which I could mine. I was mining for about a minute before the island started shaking and eventually disappeared. I'm assuming it's some sort of giant whale or turtle that randomly appears in the ocean. Apparently this abyssal barnacle is used to make some sort of abyssal weapons, so kind of a cool event. Eventually, I found another swamp and I made myself a portal in order to have quick access to it. While in this swamp, I actually found a tower which had another Vegvisir inside, and the next boss, Bonemass, was marked on my map. And he was seriously far away from anything that I had traveled to thus far. And even worse, fortunately, this swamp didn't seem to have any sunken crypts either. So, a little more sailing. Of course, the wind was against me. And finally, I came to what seemed to be an absolutely massive swamp compared to the ones that I had seen prior. I mean, this thing stretched in all directions, and I was certain I would find a crypt here. So I set a portal down and prepared to go crypt hunting. And sure enough, within a few moments of exploring, I found my first crypt, but I forgot my swamp key, so I had to head back. But finally, we made it into the crypt, and got more iron. Not too much this time, only about 30, but still better than nothing. I was kind of worried at this point that you could only actually find one sunken crypt per swamp, but that seemed to not be the case, as after swimming across a decent-sized river, I actually did find another crypt, which had a ton of iron. Like, this crypt was the complete package. Maybe 6 inventories back and forth, which resulted in me having almost 200 iron back at my boat. This entire crypt took me literally over an hour to explore and get all the iron out of. However, the next crypt I found was literally the worst crypt ever, featuring only 3 different rooms and basically no iron. So that shows you how varied these can be. While exploring the other side of the swamp, I found a ton more crypts. Bear in mind, this is all in that same massive swamp that I found originally. I marked them all on my map, and so far there were 5 crypts, all within a short distance of each other. Exploring the remaining 3 probably took me another 4 hours of legitimate gameplay, because I had to constantly run back to my boat to deposit my inventories of iron. And on top of that, I had to constantly teleport back home in order to get my rested buff back and repair my pickaxe. When this ridiculous grind was all said and done, this is what my boat's storage looked like. Almost 500 iron in total. I was hoping this would be able to get me all of the iron upgrades I could possibly want and need. So I sailed back home. The wind was still against me. But now I had a bit of a new challenge. First of all, I needed to transport all of this iron from my boat's storage to my actual smelter. And then I needed to smelt all of this iron, which sounds like it won't take too long, but it actually takes about 30 seconds to smelt just 1 iron. Which means using just 1 smelter, this would potentially take 250 minutes or 4 hours. Anyway, I found a simple solution to transporting my iron. I finally made and used a cart. Now, unlike a boat, which doesn't really seem to be affected by how much weight you have stored inside of it, a cart kinda does slow down. And with this much iron inside, it took me a couple of moments to actually carry this cart all the way up the hill. But I managed it. While I was waiting for my iron to smelt, I realized I was going to need a ridiculous amount of charcoal to make this happen, which means I would need a ridiculous amount of wood. So I decided to take my tree seeds, which I had been storing for quite some time, and start planting trees all around the area. I had over 100 beech tree seeds, over 20 birch tree seeds, and even 3 acorns, which can plant oak trees. So I ran around planting them basically everywhere, hoping that they weren't too close to my home, so when I finally chopped them, they wouldn't hit any of my buildings. Eventually, it dawned on me that I could make multiple kilns and multiple smelters, so I expanded my smithing area a bit. And creating 2 smelters and 2 kilns effectively reduced my smelting time in half. It also helps that every time you go to sleep at night, your smelters and kilns will finish processing whatever they had left inside. So it was important for me to top off the iron and charcoal before I went to sleep. The next day when I woke up, all of my trees had actually already grown, which was ridiculous. The last time I had seen this island full of trees was when I first spawned in. This actually caused me to be a bit nostalgic and go back and look at the footage of this island from when I first started. How far I had come from that naked little man who didn't know how to pick up branches, how different this island looks, and how different my perspective of the whole world has changed since exploring. At this point in my playthrough, I was already coming up on 100 hours played, but I knew I had one goal in mind before finishing this review. I had to defeat Bonemass. So after about 3 hours were spent at home smelting iron, I finally had all of it. Hundreds and hundreds of iron. I even created a separate building for my actual forge because it was starting to take up too much room inside my home. I was able to upgrade my forge 7 times by creating assisting sort of workspaces like anvils and a tool rack. I also created a stone cutter, which I'm assuming is another important workstation that I'll be using a lot of in the future. With everything said and done, I had completely crafted a full iron set of armor, an iron buckler, and an iron sword, and I upgraded all of them to at least level 3. I figured with this setup, it was time to travel to the farthest I've ever been away from home. It was time to find Bonemass. So I set sail with potions and food ready to go, a portal ready to be placed, and a long, long distance ahead of me. This time, the wind was not against me, which served as a good sign to begin our journey. And finally, after what felt like about an hour of sailing, I finally made it to the landmass that I'm pretty sure Bonemass's spawn was located at. And furthermore, similar to the situation with the trader we found, this landmass featured a giant lock. So I placed a portal down to make sure we could get back home and decided to check out what this was. I came across another one of those blue translucent bubbles which prevented enemies from approaching and made my way into this sort of witch's hut. I guess this is another sort of trader. I talked to her and she sold things like candles and love potions and seaweed and other sorts of plants and ingredients. I'm assuming all of these are super useful for food and potions and whatnot. I didn't bring any coins with me this time, but Was going to have to in the future. But anyways, I made my way towards Bonemass's summoning space. Now, if you remember, there was a random item that I was finding in the crypts, and those were withered bones, which is the item you actually use to summon Bonemass. It makes sense, bones to summon a mass of bones. Now, the two previous bosses, I really had no preparation going into those fights, and with Bonemass I took much the same approach. But this is definitely where the difficulty begins to ramp up. I tried using my bow and fire arrows, but those did almost no damage. First of all, the fire debuff is removed almost immediately after being applied because we're in the swamp and everything is wet. Furthermore, it seemed like my actual arrows just did almost no damage. So I figured I was going to have to melee him. However, whenever I got super close, he was able to deal quite a lot of damage with his melee attacks. He also had an attack where he would sort of puke a bunch of poison onto the ground, which would damage you even while a poison resistance potion was active. On top of that, every few moments he would throw out a rock which would spawn 4 enemies wherever it landed, usually 2 skeletons and 2 blobs. Honestly, I spent way too long here trying to fight him, and eventually I lost my rested buff and I was out of stamina and out of arrows, and I had only chipped away about 15% of his actual health. I decided for now I need to run away, figure out how to fight this guy. So, according to some information I found online, the best way to fight Bonemass is with a blunt force object, like a mace. I had about 60 iron bars left over from our original grind and made myself an iron mace, which I upgraded a couple of times. I was rather worried because my mace's level was only 8 versus my sword's level, which was in the high 30s, that I wouldn't be able to do enough damage, but I decided I had to try anyway. Now, I knew he had his melee attack, and I figured I needed to somehow block this using my shield. Now, blocking reduces the damage you take, but when you're using a buckler type of shield, you can actually parry an attack, which makes it deal almost no damage. You parry something by blocking at the exact right moment. It's timing based, and it's a learned skill that even while fighting Bonemass, I was still trying to learn. This time I brought my best food, lots of stamina potions and lots of health potions, because the fight is in the swamp and you constantly have the wet debuff applied. And because he has so much HP, I was probably going to lose my rested buff before the fight was actually over. So I wanted enough potions to be able to keep me somewhat mobile and active. And honestly, my second go went pretty well. It's actually a rather simple fight once you learn to block and parry his melee attack. You can go in for a few swings before he does his poison puke, then you drag him out of the puke and parry another attack before getting in a few more swings. He throws out that rock that spawns 4 mobs, you deal with them quickly and attack him again. You do this over and over and over, and honestly the mace puts in work. Apparently it's quite important to attack enemies with the weapon that they're weak against. Where before my sword and fire arrows were dealing between 10 to 20 damage, my mace was dealing anywhere between 30 and 70, and even up to 100 when it crit. The entire fight took me, I'm not kidding, 15 entire minutes. But eventually, I finished Bonemass, and I felt like I was on top of the world. He dropped his trophy as well as an item known as a wishbone, which points you in the direction of treasure. Apparently, a new resource, silver. So I used my portal to go back home to my sacrificial stones and offered up Bonemass's head. This new power would grant me resistance to physical damage, which would probably be massively useful in the boss fights coming up. But at this point, I had officially played Valheim for 100 hours. Let's not talk about how many of those hours were spent on the pause screen. Okay, we all do it, you can't blame me. But I think I'm ready to give my full review and first impressions of what really is my first real survival game experience. Now, I have no biases or allegiances to any other survival games, as I've never really played any others. The extent of my experience would be Minecraft and a little bit of PAX Day. However, due to that, I also have nothing else to really compare and contrast Valheim with. I've never played Rust, I've never played Enshrouded, but I can say unequivocally, and with complete confidence, that Valheim is the single best gaming experience I've had in the past year. Seriously, I mean that. I will not be done playing this game now that the video is over. I am more addicted to Valheim right now than any other game I've played, probably in the past 2 years. I wake up excited to play this game, but let's talk about why that is. Well, first of all, one element that is truly lacking in a lot of modern MMOs and even RPGs is a true rag to riches story, where you start as a lowly adventurer with literally nothing, but by the end game, you are a god. A lot of games these days have you start somewhere in the middle, where you're already a renowned or well-known figure, or within just a few hours of gameplay, you're literally saving the world. I love how I played Valheim for 100 hours and I'm still living in a wooden hut and barely upgrading my armor past iron. I love how proud I feel of my longship and some of the cooler things I've crafted. I love how, even though I have the ability to craft these buildings, there's actually still room for skill expression in terms of how you design your buildings. Like, I still suck at building things, and that's something that I can get better at with practice, not just by upgrading and following some linear progression path. I love that you can literally play this game however you want to. I, of course, didn't adjust any of the difficulty settings, but if you wanted to play in a world with easy to no combat where you just gather resources and build a village or a castle or a giant city, you can do that. And finally, the combat. At first, I was so nervous and scared of the creatures out in the world, where earlier on in my playthrough, a skeleton would be able to kill me, but towards the end, I was fighting a boss that could spawn 4 skeletons with 1 attack, and I was able to deal with it. The progression through being able to take on more and more difficult challenges and monsters feels so completely satisfying and makes you feel like you're getting stronger and better at the game with every given moment. I'll be honest, I have never felt better about spending $20 on an early access game in my life. I currently have 100 hours played, but I expect within the next year I'll have over 1,000. However, it would be irresponsible if I didn't call out at least some of my complaints about the game. First of all, I noticed that the game is sort of laggy in certain areas, especially when there's a ton of enemies around or with a ton of built items in one location. The game can stutter a little and obviously needs a bit of work in terms of optimization. Secondly, I think sailing is artificially difficult at the beginning of the game. I understand that there's a boss later on that grants you the award to control the wind a bit more, and maybe I was just unlucky, but I found sailing early on to be more annoying than actual fun. Anyway, folks, I hope this helped you decide if Valheim is something that you should try out now or in the future. I hope you enjoyed watching me struggle but eventually flourish in my first real attempt at a survival game. And most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, I want to say a massive thanks to everyone who watched to the end. Don't forget a like, a comment, a sub. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. But I'll catch you all in the next one. Later.